So in part 3, I described how psychology treated Indigenous people badly in the past. And in this part, I'm going to dig deeper, see if we can find out why psychology did such bad things. And I'll then tell you what is wrong with psychology's approach to indigenizing the curriculum. Why I'm negative about back to the story, because I've got a story. So I've got some top tips on writing. I told you to think critically. It helps people like me stop doing stupid things. Anyway. So from looking at the APS Apology, the APS Reconciliation Action Plan, and the AIPEP Curriculum Framework, which I covered in part 3, you get the sense of 3 things about Australian psychology. 1, it looks like it has a poor understanding of its own history. 2, it's thrown everything into a reconciliation approach. And 3, it has adopted a paternalistic protectionist approach. Let me explain why each of these things are bad things for psychology and for Indigenous people. So, point 1, a poor understanding of its own history. Just as with the rest of the non-Indigenous Australian culture, psychology appears to be forgetful about the violence of colonisation. But psychology isn't just forgetful, it actually manipulates history. Psychology uses history to serve its own purposes, and you can see that in the way it teaches its students about its history.
Psychology began to emerge as a field distinct from philosophy in the 19th century. This school of thought became known as structuralism, as Wundt believed that introspection would eventually reveal the hidden structures of the mind. Even though it has been replaced with more objective measures, this work represents the beginning of psychology as a science, because it showed that mental processes could be quantified. Another important early psychologist was American William James. He built upon Charles Darwin's ideas about natural selection. These days, this work has evolved into a branch of study called evolutionary psychology, which attempts to explain psychological processes such as perception, language, and memory as being the product of evolutionary adaptation.
Psychology has been criticized for using history as a form of self-celebration and teaching its students about psychology's great achievements. What's wrong with that? Isn't it a good thing for psychology to acknowledge its achievements? Why not tell our students how great we are? Wouldn't that make them feel honoured and proud to be part of this fine institution? Well, the problem is that this is bad scholarship. It ain't good for a profession that trains its students in institutions of higher education, that trains its students in academic skills. It might be good for public relations in a corporation or for burger flippers in McDonald's. And by the way, nothing wrong with either of those career choices. I'm not judging you.
Bob's Burgers!
But it's not good for training the next generation of psychologists. We shouldn't celebrate psychology's history, rather we need to critically reflect on its history, because it's in its history that we're able to see what's been done wrong in the past and what needs to be done better in the future. And when we celebrate the history of psychology, we talk about all of its great achievements over the past 150 years. What happens when we take a critical look at the history of psychology? Well, what we find is a profession that's full of conflicts between various encampments.
Even psychologists are divided on it.
A history full of mistakes, missteps, and wrongdoing.
Those damn psychologists prescribe all kind of medicines to you children.
And a history of being appropriated by powerful interest groups.
Is it a disease, or is it a way for these psychologists to line their pockets?
Whether that be government, corporate bodies, or being swayed by public opinion. The other common thread that runs through psychology's history is a steadfast attachment to the field of biomedicine and to biological explanations for human experience. Now, from the worst days of scientific racism through to today's blind adherence to the biomedical notion of mental illness, it's that thread that keeps psychology tied to its uncomfortable past. So point 2, throwing everything into the reconciliation camp. The Australian historian Jim Berryman cites 3 characteristics of non-Indigenous Australian culture. These are 1, an acceptance of its British heritage, 2, the adoption of a Judeo-Christian belief system, and 3, an adherence to the rational principles of enlightenment. What this means for psychology is that it has accepted its foundational knowledge, much of the work undertaken by British psychologists. It also pushes, particularly strongly, the main doctrine of the Christian Church. But it doesn't call it religion, it calls it science. So it pushes the idea of the primacy of the individual, the singularity of reality, there's only one reality, and reductionist methods of inquiry. So, like truth can be discovered or should be discovered through the microscope. This is the same as saying we're made in the image of God, that there's only one God, and God is in everything, from the big to the very, very small. Now, I'm not trying to weave together some sort of weird conspiracy theory here, where the church is secretly smuggling God into psychology. It's not that, I promise you. But it is an acknowledgement of how religious doctrines have been baked into our culture. They were baked in to our culture during the Age of Enlightenment, when state and church were separated, and where religious and scientific thought were accommodated in a way that allowed their coexistence. Now, this is one way of understanding why we find Australian psychology and Western psychology more generally grounded in a monotheist, objectivist, reductionist paradigm, because that is largely compatible with Christian belief systems.
I mean, God. There's one God. Only one.
One simple truth.
And this is why there is such a gulf between knowledge that comes from Australian psychology and the knowledge systems of Indigenous Australians, because Indigenous knowledge systems are largely grounded in an animistic, polytheist, subjectivist, holistic paradigm. So animistic polytheism, that's the belief that the natural world has soul or spirit and there's more than one God.
Actually, in our system of belief, there are many gods.
There's no more truth out there.
You are one with the universe.
So for many Indigenous people, there's not one God and there's not one truth and there's not an objective world that exists independently of us, but there are multiple truths, multiple realities, and we're connected to the world around us at a deeply spiritual level. Why have I gone off talking about religious beliefs? Well, it's because it helps us understand the main problem with the reconciliation project embarked upon by the APS. And by the way, that reconciliation project mirrors that which dominates the mainstream political response to Indigenous people in Australia. And it mirrors the reconciliation project taking place in many parts of the world that have suffered the violence of colonisation. This is that the reconciliation project starts with an assumption that the truth will heal and rebuild a shattered past. Truth is central to that process, and this is why in South Africa it's called the Truth and Reconciliation Project. And what's the nature of that truth? Well, it's an absolutist, objective and universal truth. There is only one truth. So Indigenous knowledge systems hold that there are multiple truths. So there's this fundamental problem of what the Reconciliation Project aims to be sorry about and how it intends to heal, because there's a fundamental disagreement about the nature of truth, which is the thing that is supposed to be the focus of both the apology and of the healing. So the third point, infantilization, and this is the final point I'm going to make in this video. So infantilization and paternalism. Now, do you remember me talking in part 1 and part 3 of this video series about how Indigenous people in Australia were treated in the early days? They were treated as primitive and childlike, and how little acknowledgement was given to the complex social and cultural systems that characterized Indigenous nations. Well, that infantilization and the paternalism that accompanied it is alive and well in the Indigenising the Curriculum project that's rolling out in psychology in Australia. Now, you can see this in how the APS Reconciliation Action Plan and the Curriculum Framework document from the AIPEP describes a harmonious relationship between Indigenous knowledge and Western psychology. What we see here is a particular type of space being prepared for Indigenous knowledge to sit in the psychology curriculum. It's a subjugated space. It's constructed so as to cause no disturbance to the non-Indigenous population or their knowledge system. The intent is to create a harmonious space for Indigenous knowledge in the curriculum.
Working together in harmony.
Now that intent is not just really Pollyanna-ish, over-optimistic. It's actually deeply paternalistic and infantilizing. What we're presented with is a space for Indigenous knowledge that's nothing more than an enclosure.
Then put yourselves in the cage and lock the cage.
There's little or no acknowledgement of the bleed between Indigenous and Western knowledge systems that occurred through colonization, which means there's no pristine, pure Indigenous knowledge system. There's also little or no acknowledgement of the friction and antagonism that sits between Western and Indigenous knowledge systems. The antagonism that, alongside Western greed for land, led to so many Indigenous people being slaughtered by the soldiers of the West. Instead, we have an acritical rendering of Indigenous knowledge, something that should be protected and isolated and celebrated. Now, before I settled in Australia, I remember attending academic conferences in Australia where I experienced a real sharp sting of disapproval from white Australian conference audiences when I asked a critical question of an Indigenous speaker. The social norm was, and I think still is, that you don't engage in scholarly debate with Indigenous speakers, that their knowledge was not to be critically engaged with.
Homer, I want you to look at this drawing Bart did.
Oh, it's beautiful. Oh, let's put Bart's beautiful drawing up on the fridge.
Homer, stop. Would you please look at the drawing?
Oh, all right. Burn it! Send it to hell!
The Indigenizing the Curriculum project is doing just that. What it's doing is it's signaling to society that Indigenous knowledge is not to be taken seriously. It's not grown-up knowledge. It's not a grown-up knowledge system, but rather should be treated like the crayon scrolls of a young child, or as an unadulterated archaeological artifact to be exhibited behind glass. It's something either to be observed, or you just patronize your child and say, that's a wonderful drawing, I'll stick it up on the fridge with the other wonderful art you've created. That's still how it is in Australia. Not much has changed, and not much has changed since way back when we had the Congress of Psychology happening, International Congress of Psychology happening in Australia. Remember when I told you about that exhibition of Indigenous skulls at the 1988 conference? Nothing's changed much since then. We're still doing it. We're still putting Indigenous knowledge in the glass cabinet and just kind of looking at it, going, wow, look at that curious thing. Now, paternalism thrives in universities. Remember how I talked in part 3 about how the English common law notion of loco parentis was adopted by Indigenous protection boards in the late 1800s? Well, it was also adopted by universities, but here it wasn't against Indigenous people, but it was against students in general. So loco parentis was part of the university system. It formed part of the policies enacted by university systems. Now, it's not formally adopted by universities anymore, but you can still see its legacy in how student loans are administered, how pastoral care is organised, and how you can mostly still catch academics like me referring to their students as kids. I mean, we all do it. We catch ourselves and say, oh, I shouldn't be saying that, but we still do it. It's because of that inherent paternalism that's still there in the university system. You can also see its influence, and some would say its resurgence, through the increased use of student satisfaction and student experience surveys that are less interested in students' academic and professional development and more interested in students' personal, moral and social lives. Are they getting satisfaction out of what they're doing? Are they happy? I want my kids to be happy. Are our kids happy? So, most tellingly, this legacy of loco parentis in universities can be seen in how pedagogy is the term that is most often used. It's almost universally used in the university system to describe university learning and teaching philosophies. Pedagogy actually means the teaching of children. So, the correct term to use for the teaching of adults would be andragogy, but higher education sees little reason to adopt that term. We're already seeing the Indigenising the Curriculum project in Australia discussing Indigenous pedagogies, So it actually refers to teaching children when it's talking about teaching Indigenous knowledge. So there can be no better institution to continue the paternalistic protectionist practices towards Indigenous people than a university. Okay, so how do we fix all of this and find a way for psychology to adopt a more progressive, less racist approach to indigenizing the psychology curriculum? Well, I'll talk about that in the final part of this series, which is part 5, which is coming up soon. So till then, ta-da.